All right. So, I'm going to assume you guys have Blender installed. If you would like to follow along. Um, if you just want to observe, I also understand. Let's start the presentation. Um, and while I'm speaking, if I say something that doesn't make sense or perhaps you want more explanation, just stop me, like, in a classroom, and I will be happy to elaborate further. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is the intro to low poly level design, and I am the presenter today, Kyle Lin. This is how I would go about describing and thinking about retro 3D graphics. Um, and okay, so just as an introduction to myself, um, I am a game programmer and a pixel artist. I mostly do 3D stuff these days, but I got my start making stuff in like 2D RPGs back in the day. And so I've been doing this as just, just a hobby for the better part of a decade now. I just got a degree in computer science and game development from Cal State Monterey Bay, and I still do not know what a computer is. As is customary in my department, whenever I do a presentation, I will show an animal. Um, this is not my pet. This is my friend Lux's cat, Lynchy, kind of like lychee, like the fruit, but pronounced weirdly. They're very cute. Today, I'm going to go over a handful of topics, and then I'm going to do a demo in Blender. So we're going to go over some general level design principles, some modeling and texturing techniques, and some lighting and effects. But first, let's take a look at some nice examples of what we mean by low poly 3D. So here I've got a handful of games. There's Okami, there's The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, there's Banjo-Kazooie, and Spyro. Um, so when we mean low poly 3D, we're talking about the very early days of 3D graphics, from like the mid 90s all the way to like the mid 2000s. So that like whole decade when these sort of techniques would have been really popular. There's more Spyro, there's Paper Mario Thousand Year Door. That's the entire beach level from Pokemon Snap. And then there's also the first level of Katamari Damacy. Um, there's a more modern example, A Short Hike. Uses a lot of really fun techniques, but in a contemporary way. Um, there's Majora's Mask, RuneScape, and Crazy Taxi. So before we think about modeling or uh, designing things that are a lot of effort, the first thing we want to do is make sure we know what we're doing. And I like to use the metaphor of a recipe. We need a way to explain what it is we're doing and how we're doing it. Just like making chili, you need to follow a recipe, which means you have to first create a recipe. Um, you're not making stew, you're not making soup or chowder, you're making chili. And so you have to describe the steps involved in making chili. Um, and one way of doing that is opening up a text document and writing out these four things. What is your goal? Um, is your player supposed to discover something? Are you supposed to be afraid? Is it like a mystery? What is there something to solve? And then, based on that, you write out what your palette is, or what gameplay elements do you have to work with. That's things like enemies, like the layout of your level itself, what things you can interact with, what things are blocking you, the sort of things that you need to have like a programmer or an artist make before you start designing a level. And then you figure out what are the story beats you want to accomplish. So narratively, what major things happen in that play space. If it's like a very linear narrative-oriented game, then this will be really important. If it's more of a sandbox, then maybe that's not as important. And even if there are interactive elements or multiple paths you can go down, there's always a linear sequence of time where the player does things step by step by step. So writing all those things out, getting a clear idea on paper of what it is you're going to do will help everything else in the process. And then the next thing you want to do is do some prototyping. Again, not in Blender or any 3D modeling software, but on paper. So if you're familiar with being a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons, this will be very similar to you. Creating the entire dungeon and labeling where everything is, what happens, what obstacles and challenges are in the way. And then you can finally start considering what is it you're going to make. So we use this technique called gray boxing to make a very rough version of your environment using basic primitive shapes, maybe a little bit of color here and there, but all of the elements should be here. There are various tools to do this. In Unity, you have ProBuilder. In Godot, you have CSG boxes and other primitive geometries. And then you can also just go straight to Blender, which is what I'll do. And this is a great way for people to rapidly prototype, check and see if the space between all of the different elements sort of lines up, if everything feels correct, and then they can make adjustments if it does not, and then later on they can add the final elements. So what is a level anyway? Is it a stage? Is it a chapter? Is it a sandbox? Well, it's kind of all of these things. It's just a way to delineate space for the player to do stuff in. There are some major types like alleyways and mazes, where you basically have very linear experiences. Maybe you're telling a story, or you're running through a dungeon or a city, and your places you can go are narrowly defined by that alley space. Contrast that with an island. You can think of that as like more of a big room to explore, where it's not as linear, and the first instances of this were just like basically tiny rooms. But as processing power got better and better, this evolved into the entire genre of open world games. And here's some examples from Mario 64. There's very linear style levels, like the Bowser challenges, or Jolly Roger's Bay. And then there's the more open-ended levels, like Bob-omb Battlefield and Lethal Lava Land. In both of those, it's not nearly as obvious where you should be going, so it does give you the freedom to explore and play around. We also have a lot of design influence from theme parks, like Disney. Disney does a very clever job of guiding your experience with landmarks and waypoints all around the parks that you walk between. They call them weenies, but they're essentially sort of like towers or major landmarks that you're naturally drawn to. And the same thing happens in games. Going back to Mario 64, when you first start the game, you are greeted with a huge castle in a pretty safe space. And so your first instinct is to go towards that major landmark. Same thing with Bob-omb Battlefield. The first thing you see is, that huge mountain. And so that sort of guides everything that you can do. Or, so basically, we start considering different art styles that use these limited resources because back in the early days, they had very, very limited hardware. And they also had different architectures that we'll see that sort of influenced why they look the way they do. I'm going to use two examples, the N64 and the PlayStation 1. So the N64 had things like slow texture access, right? So it has very small textures. The games themselves were limited to 64 megabytes. And so they had to come up with some very clever techniques like texture filtering, or another one that is pretty common is there's a lot of anti-aliasing. The PlayStation 1, on the other hand, had a lot of the opposite problems. So the PlayStation 1 had these huge CD-ROM discs that gave them a lot of memory to work with, but they also had things like no floating point math, which means the vertices, the points in the geometry, they essentially snap really awkwardly, which creates a very iconic sort of animation. And it also doesn't really do perspective correctly when you're doing textures. So all of those things together create like those very iconic quirks. And so being the case that we don't really have to worry about memory and processing power these days, what is it we're actually trying to do? Are we trying to recreate those systems exactly? Well, no. We're trying to do what games like Shovel Knight and UFO 50 do, where they capture the essence of what a game from 1988 would have looked like. They use the same color palette and they use the same sort of low resolution, but they use a lot of techniques that just simply were not possible. For example, rotating sprites or doing anything with fixed point numbers. And so what you get is a lot of games made these days end up looking like games from the end of the NES's era, like, the early 90s, when they really started to push that system to its absolute limits and things started looking really, really good. So our goal is basically to use limited polygons, use inexpensive calculations, small textures, and create stylized or minimalist models and geometry. And fake lighting is another one I'll talk about. So Blender is my preferred 3D modeling software. It is free and open source. And using it, we can do all sorts of fun things like modeling, sculpting, animating, everything we need to do. There's all sorts of crazy uh, keys that you can memorize, but you don't need to learn all of this to get started. There's only like 3 buttons you really need to know. So one of the techniques we're going to be using is UV mapping, which is essentially putting a texture onto a piece of geometry like a sticker. So here you see some demonstrations of a texture going onto a character, onto a globe, and see those bottom examples are cubes that have been unwrapped. So if you imagine the cube being unwrapped from 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, that's sort of the goal. And if you're a pixel artist, you may already be familiar with game engines like RPG Maker. They use this technique of putting all of their art in tile sets so that they can be reused. In 3D, we have an analog called trim sheets, which is essentially the same thing. You're just bunching all of those textures together in a reusable way. One really fun example of this is Silent Hill 1, where the levels are divided into these chunks that have like 1 trim sheet each. They're like 8 by 8, 32 pixel square textures that can be applied to every single part of that building or that room, whatever scene you need. And as some foreshadowing, this is essentially the technique that I'm going to be emulating later on. Another technique that the N64 specifically used, and game engines and other 3D software uses today, is texture filtering. For the N64, this came native because they had very low resolution textures by default. So they had to find some way of sort of like blurring them together. So in the bottom image where you see Zelda, the ground textures and the texture on that building, they're very blocky. So applying a texture to it, or sorry, a filter to it, means that you sort of get more color because it's interpolated as it's being drawn. And the N64 used a method of sampling 3 neighboring pixels. So it uses this like unique diamond shape that doesn't really exist on any other system. On the flip side, if you're trying to get really, really crisp pixel art, you don't want any filtering at all. So you do what's called the nearest neighbor, or point sampling, which means you get a 1-to-1 of like the texture you apply to what is rendered. Another technique you can see here in Banjo-Kazooie is different textures can be blended together. So these path textures get blended in with the grass. One of my favorite techniques, and one we'll be talking about later, is vertex colors. There's different layers of color that can be applied to different shapes. So the vertices of these shapes can hold a color, right? Like in that triangle, you see the simplest possible example of this with the R, the G, and the B on each corner. So what happens when that triangle is drawn on the screen is it goes pixel by pixel and interpolates between the 2 colors, right? So between red and green, it's more yellow. Between blue and red, it's more purple, and so forth. And a very common technique is combining texture data with vertex colors in order to create more depth and more dynamic colors. So in Mario 64, the the final fight with Bowser, most of the game he's got his normal textures, but in that fight, he looks more rainbowy because he has those added layer of vertex colors. Another fun fact with that specifically is that just happens to also be a normal map. And I'll explain what that is later. Here's an example from The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, with the left being without vertex colors, and the right showing what happens when you do add those. So there's a few techniques that just make it look a lot better. There's fake shadows on the cliffside, and if you look at the water, it's sort of in a grayscale. So when you do apply like blue colors on top of it, it gives that black and white water a tint of blue. So in that way, you can repeat the same grayscale texture and apply another layer of color and get a lot more mileage out of it. Games are also smoke and mirrors. They lie to you about everything. So for example, if something is in 3D, one way to save on processing is by just using flat planes instead of drawing a whole model. Because if you draw a flat plane, that's only like 2 polygons versus however many to create that volume. And this also brings me to the number one rule of graphics. If it looks correct, it is correct. And what I mean by that is you're always going to be using some sort of trick of the camera or perspective or something to make something look good without actually rendering it fully. Here's some fun examples of that. The sky is fake. It's not real. It's just a cube with textures applied to it. And pretty much every 3D game uses some variation of this. Sometimes they'll use like a sphere or some more complicated system, but fundamentally you're sort of faking the horizon. And another technique that I personally use all the time is billboarding. I alluded to it before, but basically this allows you to use 2D art in a 3D world. There's a very simple version where you just have a sprite that is always facing the camera, as in the tree in Super Mario 64. But there's a more advanced technique that's called directional sprites, which means whatever object you're looking at, it holds like the position, like it has a front, right? And so if you like look around it, it'll change the sprite that is rendered to match the direction that it's looking. And that can get pretty complicated. People can do things like take screenshots of like a 3D model and render like one sprite at a time, depending on the direction. As you can imagine, there's a lot of math involved, mostly like linear algebra stuff, to get that angle correctly. But it does save a lot of processing because, again, you're saving dozens of polygons, if not more. And then this brings us to one of my favorite topics, lighting. Because, my goodness, if you thought that stuff was fake, lighting is certainly fake. Here's some fun pictures. So, a lot of games try to have some sort of lighting model that emulates real world physics, right? So you have a light source that is emitting something and then it hits a surface and then something happens to that light. So you have light that spreads out in all directions. Depending on the coarseness of the material, you may have that light spread more randomly. If it's more of a mirror, then it will be more concentrated, like you would expect a mirror to preserve that image. And a lot of the lighting calculations that we try to figure out are based off of this fundamental idea of like, what is the direction the light is coming from? And what is the direction the surface is facing? And using just that information alone, you can get a variety of different effects. For example, if you just use the direction of the surface itself, you get flat shading, which is that first sphere. And that kind of looks okay. You can see some shadows being created. A next step up from that is Gouraud shading, which sort of does the same thing as flat shading, except now you're also taking a look at the vertex colors. And this is what most low poly games did back in the day. They didn't have a specular highlight portion. They just used this. And then lastly, you have a more sophisticated model called Phong, which is sort of a combination of different components. You have specular highlights, and then you have ambient color, and then you have the way that light is spread out diffusely. Here's a good demonstration of that on the top picture. So the Phong model takes some sort of ambient color, which is some scaled down version of either like the surface color or what we call the albedo, where it's just like pure color or texture. And then it adds the diffuse portion, which is where you take the direction of light and sort of how it falls off into account. And lastly, you have the specular portion, which is where you get those highlights. And that is, interestingly, very observer dependent. So using like the standard model of how to model these substances, you get things like the roughness, how metallic it is, and how specular it is. So fun thing about most low poly graphics, we're not going to use any of this. Another thing that we can use is a normal map. As I sort of was talking about before, a surface normal is the direction that that surface is facing. So if you have like a flat wall, then it's going to be completely perpendicular to it. But a normal map does this fun thing where you can manipulate the direction that light bounces off of the surface at that point, turning, for example, this flat brick wall on the bottom to something that looks like it has a lot more depth, using no more geometry, using just color calculations that has to be performed on every pixel anyway. So you don't actually have to spend that many resources, but you get an incredibly powerful effect. Another fun fact about that is you can also hand paint a normal map. So on the right-hand side here, we have an example of pixel art that has been given a normal map so that the light that's coming off of that character's lantern is going to realistically shine on that character's body. And so the very top there, you see an example of what artists can use to like grab the color of like what direction the light should be bouncing off of. And as I said before, we're basically going to be ignoring most of those techniques because of the limited processing power of, say, the N64. We basically just care about diffuse lighting and vertex colors. On Mario's body here, you can see some examples. I think it's faked a little bit, but you see a lot of diffusion happening based on the direction of the light and also like the direction that surface is facing. And then on the right-hand side, you see a lot of this boss from Ocarina of Time, Bongo Bongo. A lot of the color, the shadow is implied, is all vertex colors. All right, this brings us to our next topic, shaders. This is sort of how all of the magic happens. And I'm not going to explain fully what it means to be a shader, but the long and short of it is it's this process of converting information such as positional data and texture data step by step into a 3D environment or world or whatever. And the reason why we care about this is because of this fun principle where if you want something done really fast, like drawing a piece of geometry 60 times a second, you have to have some sort of specialized hardware that will be able to do all of those calculations in parallel really, really fast. And so that's what a GPU does. Your graphics processing unit has to talk to your CPU, and it's like delivering all of the information for what should be rendered on the screen in a certain format, and then the GPU does its magic to render all of it really, really fast. The steps involved here are essentially taking the points in the mesh, drawing the shapes between them, and then we do this process called rasterization, where once you've created those pieces of geometry, you apply color to them. Those colors are called fragments. And then finally, you essentially figure out the depth of where everything is, and then draw it from back to front, like a painter would draw a landscape. So there's two big ideas to take away here. If you want anything with color changed, that's done with a fragment shader. So for example, pretty much all lighting and all textures, that's going to be a fragment shader. If you want something with position changed, like for example, making waves in water, um, that's going to be a vertex shader because what you're doing is manipulating the position of the vertices. And that middle picture right there is sort of an example of that. Here's an example of a metallic shader that my friend made based off of the N64's capability of emulating metal. As you can see, it sort of looks very similar because it uses a different type of calculation than everything around it. So what you do is assign every single material a unique shader. And that shader says, well, okay, so based off of the environment around it and the texture information and any attributes you give it, it'll create the color at that specific pixel or that specific fragment. And so this metal shader, for example, uses some vectors pointed outward towards whatever's around it and grabs some information like a mirror and sort of gives you the calculation based on that. There's a whole world to explore out there of various shaders, and there's a lot of different effects. There's shaders that will limit the amount of colors that are being displayed. Very similar to when you're drawing pixel art. You can use quantization to limit your color palette. A very similar thing happens with like dithering, like the PlayStation 1 was capable of, and it happens on the fly. So maybe the texture that is applied to that geometry is a different color, and then you have some sort of post-processing effect that iterates through the entire screen and draws it. It changes it slightly to make it easier to render. You also have some fun cartoon effects like adding like bands of highlights or outlines. That's also done with shader code. All right, so that brings us to the technique that I've been developing based on iterating over different 3D games for the last couple years. And I'm going to give you a couple examples to help you understand where I'm coming from here. So if you've ever played Minecraft, you probably know the world is divided into these chunks. They're like 16 by 16 by some height chunks that all of the world data is saved into. And because it's an open world game, those all the chunks around you are rendered in and out seamlessly to give you the illusion of an infinite world. The exact same thing happens in the game RuneScape, where you have these huge areas like a village or a city or whatever. They're all self-contained in one chunk that maybe contains a bunch of NPCs or shops or other things you interact with. And with RuneScape, especially when I first started developing my capstone game, I tried to figure out a way to create content for the game little by little over time and sort of emulate the development process of RuneScape. because that game over the last 20 something years has developed very slowly. At first, it was like, just that little village, and then they kept expanding and expanding, adding mechanical depth and stuff to interact with and new areas. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from with the style of level design that I will show you guys. That's the end of the presentation. And then the next thing I will do is show you guys Blender. So this is sort of like one example of the end where I've got this one area that has textures applied to it and also vertex colors. And I'll show you how I did that and then how to import that into Godot. I know someone asked me to show Unity, but that's sort of outside of the scope today. Okay, so let me show you how I set up my my workspace for this kind of modeling. So I'm going to go General. I'm going to delete all this stuff, and then going over to Scene, I'll go to Units. I'll change it from Metric to None, and then up here with the Viewport Overlays, this little button right here, I will go over to Scale here and go 1/4 for the scale and subdivisions 1. And what I'm doing here is basically changing the scale of like how the world treats its units. If it's none, then I can have like really fine-tuned control over like the space here. Okay, and then I want to turn snapping on, which is this little magnet button up here, and make sure it's increment. Great. Okay, and then I'll add the geometry that I'm working with Shift S, or sorry, Shift A. There we go. That'll bring up this menu, or you can press this button up here. So Shift A, and then I will go Mesh, and then add a grid. So a grid here is sort of like a plane that's been subdivided. And then here I can specify the size of it. I'll go 20. So it's a lot bigger now. And then I want, just for the sake of example, I want a 20 by 20 space here. But you can do this with any size. If you wanted like a larger chunk, you could go maybe like 32 or even 64 by 64. But, just keep in mind, the larger it is, the more like sculpting and stuff you have to do. Okay, great. So we're in object mode. If you want to go to edit it, you can just press the tab button. And so now you can see we have this thing to work with. Great. So this is where I would begin sculpting or making whatever it is. There's a few different ways we can do this. I'll show you guys how to make like an island style level, which I think would be closer to what I was describing before with like RuneScape or Minecraft. So I'll select everything. I am going to extrude it along Z1 just to give it a little bit of depth here. So we're not dealing with just a plane. So what shall we make? Maybe like a cliffside or maybe a forest. Any suggestions? I think I'll just go with the cliffside like before. Okay, so one thing I can do is go over here to my knife. Um, Here's a lot of tools available to me. I can also, if you have a full keypad, you can press the buttons here, like 8, 4, 6, and 2, to get an orthographic view of whatever you're working on. Or you can go over here and press like this button here. So what I'm going to do is just start cutting along here to give myself some smooth cliff faces and press enter. Okay, and then go over here, select the lasso tool. This will make this a little easier. So I'll just select everything I just cut. Rotate a little bit so I can see better. And then I will extrude with E, a length 1. And then I'll do that again. Length 1. And then as you can see, when I press the E button, there's this blue thing that shows you it's moving along the Z-axis. You can also change this to the Y-axis or the X-axis by pressing X or Y respectively. Um, but we want to do Z and then 1. Great. Okay, so now we have our cliff face. And then I think, gosh, how about a lake? Um, so I will do something similar. I will take a knife and I'll go into an orthographic view. I'll just start cutting this until we have a nice lake. Okay, great. So we have that. I'm going to go back to my lasso tool and select everything very carefully. Okay, so now we can do sort of the same thing in reverse here. So I can go, instead of extruding, I'm going to grab it or move it with G and go on the Z-axis, negative 0.5. There we go. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a lake. Okay, so we've got a lake and a cliffside. That's pretty fun. How about adding some textures? Okay, so I mentioned trim sheets before. I did go and find a bunch of textures from Open Game Art mostly that I compiled into this sheet. So it's 256 by 256 pixels, and each of these is 32 by 32. So one way to help view that is going to grid and go 32 by 32. And then if you wanted to just like paint these yourself, you know, you can limit yourself to like, you know, one square at a time. So that's how you would organize this. Okay, let me just... Actually, there's one more thing I would like to do before we move to texturing. And Um, this level is fine and good so far, but I just want to um, sculpt a little bit to make it more varied. So I'll go here. By the way, you can change the view of your model by cycling through these. I think this will work just fine. So all of these are different options for sculpting. Um, you can move the mesh around this way. Um, but if you want to make sure the mesh is not distorted, so like if I was to like smooth the corner here, it would like be drawn inward. If you want to prevent that so it like stays a perfect square, there's a couple things you can do. Let's see, go to the tool settings. So like this tool specifically, we're going to go to advanced. We're going to go mesh boundary and check that to on. That's all we needed advanced. And then in symmetry, we want to make sure this is turned off, X mirroring. So if we go over to this corner, we should, oh wait, no. There we go. Should get like a little bit of distortion, but not so much that it like changes a whole lot. There we go. And that helps make the terrain a little bit more varied by again sort of changing the direction that the light is facing. And then I'll also do the same thing with the smooth. Where's the smooth? There we go. Again, X symmetry turned off, and then advanced mesh boundary checked. So if I go smooth, oh, whoa. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so that distorts it a little bit. But not too much. There we go. So, all right. So that's a lot more interesting. And you know, you can go as much as you want with this sculpting. Um, okay, so now I think would be a good time to start texturing. Oh, one more step actually that will help us. Since we want to stay snapped to the grid that we established before, let me go back to layout, and then I'll go back to object mode, press tab for edit. So the next thing I will do is select everything with A, and then Shift S to open up this radial menu, and we're going to go selection to grid. There we go. And so it was very subtle, but what that did is it snapped all the vertices to the grid that we established at the beginning. Excellent. Okay, so the next thing we can do is set up our material. Let me just make sure I remember how to do that. I'm trying to follow what I did before. Okay, so we want to go to the shading tab. So here's where we can set up our material. We're going to make a new material, and there's the output here, and by default it gives us a principled by bidirectional something or other. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a type of shader that uses that like standard model. We don't need that. We're going to add a few different things here. Let's see, mix, color mix. There we go. This node we're going to feed into Surface. And what this is going to do is take two inputs. One is going to be the textures, and the other is going to be the vertex colors. So I'm going to go, instead of mixed here, we're going to multiply and set this factor to 1. And then I'm going to add an input texture image. All right, and then one color from here. We can open models. So I'm gonna give it this trim sheet. There we go. That's all fucked up, but we'll fix it later. Just as a side note, I talked about texture filtering before. So this is where you can change that. So if we zoom in here, this texture is very blurry. If we want that crisp pixel art look, we can go and change this to closest. So now that option gives us a lot more crisp pixel art, which is maybe the desired effect, maybe not. Yeah, let's just keep it there. And then for the vertex colors, we're going to be using, it's called color attribute. There we go. And then this is going to go into the B slot. Very good. Let's see. Actually, for now, let's ignore that and let's just focus on texturing. Okay, so in order to fix this, we have a few things we have to do. We're going to go to UV editing. This is where you change all of this stuff. I'm going to go up here again. There we go. So I'm going to go Control A on this screen. And everything here is really fucked up. So we're going to go U and then reset that. Great. Okay, so that changes it all to basically being like taking up the entire texture, which is not what we want, but we can easily fix that by going here. And then we're going to press S to scale. And instead of like dragging this manually, I will go 1/8. Oops, no, not 18. 1/8. There we go. So it's 1/8 of the size. So all of these are going to correspond with exactly one texture. In order to make it snap, we can go to grid and this little magnet button here. There's also this UV, which will, we want to constrain to image bounds. So for example, we can press, we can highlight all this, G to grab, let's see, oh, we don't actually want that. Let's go increment again. There we go. Okay, so let me show you that again. Basically, I grabbed everything, and so everything on the mesh is currently set to this grass texture. And we can move it around to a different texture, like, for example, this sand. Okay, that's all well and good, but we don't want everything to be sand. So what we're going to do is grab, let's see, I'll press 3 to grab the face, and I think it's Shift-Alt. Shift Alt, there we go, to grab this entire thing, then Shift Alt again, no, Shift Alt, there we go, okay. So I want this whole thing to be stone. Okay, so I'll go over here and shift this over to stone. Okay, and then I will, oops, there we go. Shift Alt again. There we go, to grab that entire thing. And then one by one, we're basically just going to be moving this to whatever texture we actually want. Alt, there we go, once again. And then we can do things like go back to our lasso tool. So I want all of this to be grass. So I'll grab that, G to move. All right, and so just using these little techniques, we can move things around until they are what we want them to be. Let's see, reset that again. Scale to 1/8. Just go like that. Okay, so that's that. I think most of the rest of this could be grass too, so I'll just start working on that. Doesn't have to be super precise. We are not doing rocket science here. There we go. Okay. So, okay, that's all well and good. What if now this looks super flat? We don't want it to look flat. We want it to be like, you know, dynamic. And, oops, there we go. So, the next thing I'll do in order to fix that is go back to layout. So here, oh, I will go back to my shading and I'll bring back our good friend, the color attribute. There we go. Okay, so we can now do vertex painting. Hoo boy. So we want like a really dark color. And we can actually just start painting. So I want this wall to have shadow. This little area will be a lake, so I want that to have shadow. And then I think the grass over here should probably have a lighter color as well. Just, you know, change this up so it's not all the same color of green. Okay, now that's pretty intense, so I'm gonna go to this blur tool and just make this more gentle. This is just a demonstration, so you can absolutely spend as much time on this as you like, but right away you can see how much better that is, creating like these subtle shadows. There we go. All right. So now what we have is a combination of texturing and vertex color. So really, the limit to this is your imagination. The way I would assemble a like open world sort of level is I would put many of these tiles side by side and like sort of stitch them together into a larger environment. And I think at this point, does anybody have any questions? All right. Okay, so if nobody has any questions, then I think the next thing to do is to show you how to get this thing into a game engine. So there's a few different things you can do. So I'm going to go Control Shift S, and I'm going to save this. So this is currently in one of my Godot projects. So I'll just call this cliffside.blend. And so this is inside of my Godot project in a folder called models, where I have these other blend files. I'll save that. Great. Okay. The next thing I will do is open up Godot. Okay, so this is what I had before. I'll just go ahead and delete this instance of it. So this is just like my starter template that I've been working on for a while. It's got a little character. We're in this scene called game. It's got a light and a player in it. I will go now to my folder for models, where I have just saved this in cliffside.blend. I'll open this. Let's see. Okay, so the texture data was saved. Let's see. UV colors on. And import. Okay, did that fix it? There we go. Okay, so there our vertex colors, just like that. So we can close that. And one more thing that I forgot to do. Let's go back to Blender real quick. So this whole mesh is one object up here called grid. So I'm going to name it something funny so that when it's imported into Godot, it will know that it needs a collision shape attached to it. I'm going to go dash COL. And then that was a change, so I'll save it. And when I add the blend file to Godot, it's going to reflect those changes immediately. So let's open up cliffside.blend again. So now I know that worked because it added these two nodes right here, static body 3D and collision shape 3D. So that's excellent. I can close this, and now I can add this to the scene. Okay, so this should work. I'm gonna give my player, move it a little bit so he's not gonna fall when this starts. But when I start this game, it should have everything that we just made. Uh, oh, sorry if that's a little loud. Uh, there we go. Okay. Okay, that's better. uh, okay, so as you can see, we've just imported it with the correct mesh. There's vertex colors, and now we can walk around, and that is pretty much exactly what we expected. So we've got this sort of low poly look to it, and now it's all about just prettying this thing up. So we could add any number of things to this little scene. We could add like a plane here with a water effect. We could add a skybox, um, things to interact with, like this item here is an instance of an interactable, but it's not going to do anything because this is just a blank project. And that is that is working. Okay. Um, with that, I think that concludes my demo. Does anybody have any questions about anything I just went over? All right. Um, if nobody has any questions, I think that's all I had to really show you guys today. Thank you so much for coming. And as always, I've been Kyle. I will continue to be Kyle. Thank you for watching.